Today we have with us four members, from very diverse perspectives from the fintech space, and each of them kind of has a little bit of a role, so that we'll do that. So we'll start with Sharan. Sharan, at Mangaldas is an advocate for the user, and so I want to start with you in terms of, as someone who represents the users in this space, how do you see the customer protection issue?
Thanks, Sanjay. Okay, I would like to start with a caveat here, as all lawyers do. I'm the pessimist in the room. I'm going to be looking at it from a very negative lens. And we've come a long way in terms of our digital payment mechanism. 10 years back, if you would have told me that I'll be making payments from my phone, I would have laughed it off. But right now, I think it's become a reality. It is our reality. When it comes to payments in general and when it comes to consumer protection in general, I think this entire vehicle has four corners. One is industry growth. Two is regulation. Three is consumer protection and enforcement. And the enforcement part is what I'm more concerned about. And four is in relation to innovation. From a stakeholder perspective, that is something that's at the forefront. But a consumer may not be looking at that. Now, all these four wheels need to move together. While we can think of all possible mechanisms that are there in place, let's just take a simple example for a consumer who's been defrauded. I think that's the entire purpose of consumer protection. Somebody who is not aware, wants to use a platform, and ultimately doesn't realize what information he's giving out, gets defrauded, or there is a default that takes place. How do we address or protect him is the main question. There are agencies in place. There are, of course, you can go to the police. There is ED, there is CBI. But what about the small consumer? Do we actually think of it in a serious manner as to how we address their grievances? My entire purpose, at least in this discussion, would be to give some suggestions on how do we look at a small-scale consumer who may be not as important, but is a very still integral part of the entire ecosystem.
No, thanks for that, Sharan. I next want to go to Sugandh. Sugandh is the CEO of FACE, which is a self-regulatory organization. And as a self-regulatory body, how does FACE see this issue of consumer protection?
So as our name says, I think ours is the only company which has consumer protection in its name. So very close to our heart, this is the reason we are here. So I think it's fundamental to what we do and how we look at the sector. First thing, I think it's important to have a common language for the industry. What is customer protection, right? So, it can be a very confusing word. So it's important to, really unpack it into things which are actionable for the industry. So, and there's a lot of work, right? Customer protection is not a new concept. There has been, developments in the OECD countries. There's a lot of work which RBI has done. So we know fundamentally that there are 5 principles around it, which hold good for the physical world also and which hold good for the digital world also. So I think it's very important to understand what is customer protection so that industry and the consumer has right set of expectations set. So one would be fair treatment, which is, I'm not, treated unfairly in terms of biases and so on. Obviously, in the physical way, we have seen, people going to the branches and being denied access to financial services because that person was looking or, behaving in a certain way. Same can happen in the digital world where the algorithm might create certain bias, though I think that would be less compared to what you saw in the physical world. Transparency, whatever you are selling, you should have a clear information to the consumer. Again, context changes in the digital world when it's so fast, everything is on a mobile phone. You have to think about ways that this could really work, right? You can't have long documents which a person cannot read, and therefore, how do you really implement the transparency become important. Third is really, suitability, which is the most difficult part of all things. What is suitable to the consumer? Again, without being paternalistic about the whole thing that, I as a company decide. But generally, what Kunal was saying in the last session, if there is something which I'm creating, which I can offer to my friends and family, I think I'm on the right track, right? There could be some tweaks and things, but, something which is suitable. Again, people will have different definition. Privacy becomes the fourth element, which becomes increasingly important, particularly in the context of digital. And fifth element we say is, if you might be doing everything right, but ultimately we're a business at a very large scale, and therefore things can go wrong. And therefore, how do you really ensure that you are able to deal with those customer complaints? So fundamentally, these, industry has to have a common language about when we talk about the customer protection, and a very rule-based system, right? That this is what I'm supposed to do, and I'm doing it. And though what he was mentioning about really enforcing them, then becomes important. The way we look at it, I think there are a few things which are important when we talk about customer protection. One is the context, right? So in the digital lending versus payment, the context of customer protection would be very different, and therefore it's important to take them into account. Second, I think nobody can shy away from the fact that majority of our customers remain highly vulnerable. One, because for the first time they are using technology, for the first time they are using financial services. So there is no excuse to say that they must know. They don't know a lot of things, and therefore we have the responsibility to do that. From a lender's perspective, or the generally from the ecosystem perspective, customer protection should not become a tick box, I would say. It so happens because regulator is saying this, SROs are saying that. But really, comes in the way of customer centricity and the trust. And therefore, then it becomes much more than just saying that, okay, I have given you the KFS, I have given you the terms and condition, you can read it, right? Because you really want people to know, because then only you will create that trust. And finally, I think as an ecosystem, we have to really reward the customer protection, right? We have seen lot of time, even in the past, that companies grow and they reach a certain scale. There are a lot of other factors. But as an ecosystem, investors and others do not perhaps reward the companies if they go beyond something, which is customer protection. So, and we have seen in microfinance, right, there was a lot of focus on this particular dimension. But I think as an ecosystem, we really need to also celebrate things which companies are doing in that sense, which will create, of course, customer protection does not need incentive, but it still create that push which is needed to, push forward the boundaries of customer protection.
Thanks, Sugandh. And, want to come to you, Sahil. So, you're a fintech, you're caught in this space, you're the one bringing about a lot of change, and you heard what we heard from two of our other actors in the room. So what do you say about customer protection?
So I think for us as a fintech, customer protection essentially is customer education. For us, that is the key thing that we need to focus on. It starts with obviously the KFS, educating them about basic things like APR, what does an APR mean, what is your processing fee, but to some more nuanced things like what is a NACH bounce charge, or a late penalty fee. What is the difference between them? Who charges what? Is the bank charging the ACH bounce charge, or the lender themselves? So getting that education in the right way, and also figuring out the channel to educate them, because the customers that we're dealing with, they are obviously not educated enough that they can understand the KFS that we put out on our app, for example. And that essentially becomes a very interesting challenge in general, because as a fintech, you generally claim that you want to be more tech savvy and you want to cut costs and be more efficient in general. But when you start talking about customer education, you really need to find resources and innovative ways to help customers understand what you really want to sell to them. And obviously, it eventually becomes a part of customer support as well, as Sugandh mentioned, that you really need to focus about how do you manage your customer complaints in general. So I think these are the two core focus areas for us in general.
Great. No, thanks, Sahil. So come to Saurabh. So Saurabh, you represent a very different perspective on this as somebody who is in the AI space, and sort of you're representing how technology is moving ahead. So, as a technology provider, how do you see the role that you play in terms of customer protection?
Yeah, so at Sarvam AI, so we are a foundation model company based out of India, and one of the core things that we focus on is the language accessibility technology. And our mission is to do population scale AI deployment, right? So when we look at Bharat per se, right, the challenge is not just literacy, it's actually the comprehension, right? So if you present a very complicated document even in a person's own language, right, you do not have any guarantee that the person will be able to. They might be able to read it, but whether they are able to understand it or not is still a question, right? So what we do, and we are very domain agnostic in terms of the kind of technologies that we build. One of the things that we focus on is building voice-to-voice agents. So these are AI systems, very low-cost AI systems that can communicate to the end user in their own language, and both can be a guide to them in terms of understanding any material, or can be a completely assistive journey for them to take certain actions. So when I look at the customer protection, right, I think we see how can we improve the touch points that a user has with the digital technology. And when we say, like what Sugandh was saying, right, people who are interfacing with the technology for the first time, right, like these are not digital native users in some sense. So how can we create very, very effective end-to-end voice systems that can help users experience these things much more safely, much more better. So I think from an AI company perspective, from Sarvam's AI perspective, I think we focus on how can we build these AI systems which are robust, reliable, and can at the end of the day bridge the comprehension gap and make these digital technologies much more accessible to the end users.
So, Sahil, I want to come back to you on this one. So now, we hear from tech. How do you embed consumer protections directly into your products, into your business model and operations? And, we could take an example like data protection and sort of talk about how we can think about customer protection in that context.
Right. So if I, for example, let's say, if I start with data protection in general, I think even Kunal mentioned briefly about it, about how as a company itself, your employees try to use the data of customers in general, and how do they maintain or manage the data for themselves. So that differentiation needs to generally be looked at as a startup as well. And I think this is where I personally feel regulations can also be more useful in general, because while we have done a lot of work on regulations on how do you do things post that or educating the customer, but how do you protect data on the fintechs level or even probably at banks level? I think that is something that really needs to work a lot on. Personally for us, it's mostly been focused on customer support. We need to educate and talk to our customers in ways that is easily accessible to them. We have to figure out ways that really works for them. It could be as simple as I paid my EMI to somebody else, and now that person is just out of the window. How do you solve for that? So I think adding more technology to that and making sure that you're able to identify those bad actors in a good way is something that we really want to focus on in general.
So just to dig a little deeper on that, one is to educate people about the data that they're giving and when they're giving it and how you're using it. The other side is within your own employee base, how that data is handled. But then I think coming to the technology side of it, right? The question about doing it in a more cost-effective way. Is that a big part of the focus, and how do you make sure that doesn't overstep?
Right. So I think you for example, it also becomes a part of your culture over time. For example, when you talk about customers' data internally, you need to create your SOPs and models in a way that people have data on a need-to-know basis. So I think it is obviously an upfront cost in the beginning, but as you scale up, this actually becomes like a much better cost, because any amounts of fraud that you see on your 2% or 3% of your customers, that eventually also goes back to the remaining 97% of the customers. So personally, as a company, we feel that you need to put out that cost right now so that you can actually safeguard for the remaining 97% of your customers.
So Sharan, this is a rapidly evolving space. You're seeing things change pretty much every month. And yet, fintechs are quite quick to adapt technology and then take it to use cases to service customers, either to reduce costs or expand user base. But the law and regulatory frameworks are much slower to evolve and adapt. And how do you, as a user or even as an advocate for a user, navigate the space?
So I think the answer lies in the question itself. Law typically faces a lot of challenges when it comes to modification. Innovation is far more faster when it comes to uh, especially this space, the fintech space. The question right now is, what are the frameworks that are already in place? Let's just try and understand that. Do we have enough reporting mechanisms in place? Will the market player assist you in terms of reporting that fraud that has just taken place? What is the government doing? I have some data here when it comes to reporting mechanisms. So there is something called Chakshu, which has been recently introduced, where if there is a possible financial fraud that you suspect, you can report it. Then RBI has issued certain directives, of course, when it comes to KYC guidelines and other data that you retain. There is a national crime cyber reporting portal. Then, of course, you can always go to the police. There is a cybercrime cell that is there. And there are larger organizations at play when it comes to enforcement. So there are enough avenues to report it. But is that what the consumer is looking at? The consumer is somebody who has lost his hard-earned money, wants that loss to be reversed. Now, whether there is a mechanism in play that reverses that money immediately, answer to that, according to me and to my knowledge, is if it is only a failed transaction, that is when the amount gets reversed. What happens when there is somebody who is impersonating or somebody who is trying to dupe you of your money, has the money taken away from you? What can a market player do there? I can completely understand a market player perspective that they are at no fault. So this is where enforcement comes in. And it's a very important space here. And Sanjay, like you rightly said, it takes time. But there needs to be a bridge where suggestions from the market players, from the stakeholders can go through, and SROs can help in that for sure, that you need to be a little more forward thinking. Now, let's just say I think we have data of 2023, 24. So as of financial year 24, there are about 6 lakh cases of financial fraud that are already pending in different courts. I know for a fact that my friends, clients, who have reported the fraud, gone to the police, given statements, but after that nothing happens because that perpetrator cannot be found. But that data is available. At some level, there needs to be a coordination between the enforcement agencies and the market players, and maybe RBI or the SROs can suggest that the procedure be a little flexible. There are very simple solutions to all of this. One, every consumer wants a faster turnaround time. Now, that faster turnaround time can only come if you identify the jurisdictions where these frauds are primarily taking place. That data is available. That happens primarily in Maharashtra. Of course, financial capital of the country. Definitely there will be issues there. Then there is Delhi, there is Karnataka. Why don't you set up an easier procedure for ensuring that any cybercrime or fraud, financial fraud that takes place for a smaller consumer, you don't have to be bound by the rigors of the colonial evidence system, because that itself takes a long time. Why don't you have specialized court in all of these jurisdictions who can solely look into all of these issues? And if you have, in most of the cases, the police knows where the money is. The police knows that it has gone away to another account which we don't know where it is. They know who the account belongs to. But the person who has given you the complaint has never got the money back. Now, when it comes to consumer protection, the sole test, according to me, and I don't know if we'll be touching upon this topic later, the sole test, according to me, is reversal of that amount. Now, let's just take an example here. This is a live case that has happened. A friend's father, who was a retired army officer, got a call from somebody impersonating to be from a bank, told him to give his credit card details because he had some query as far as credit card is concerned. Told him to get on a WhatsApp call. There is screen sharing. Asked him to screen share. He believed it. All the money from the account got wiped out. And this was an amount of, 80,000 rupees. He goes to the police. Police finds out exactly which account it is. It's some account in Bombay. That account still has a sum of 3 lakh rupees. But there are multiple complaints against this perpetrator because he's duped 15 people. 15 people have also filed an FIR there. Now the question is, as far as a consumer is concerned, look at it from this gentleman's perspective. A retired army officer wants his money. The amount is there in the account, but he can't take it. because he needs a court order. But the court's hands are tied because they're like, okay, there are so many people who are in line. How do you distribute the money? I think in terms of understanding the problem, we are there. But in terms of going forward to keep reversal of this entire amount in mind, we are nowhere close. So that is where we need to focus on when it comes to enforcement mechanisms. You can have easier procedures so that you don't need a lawyer to go to court and present your case. If there is a specialized mechanism set, then I think we are far more towards consumer protection than we are right now.
I think I just need to add on this. It's not just about. I think it's just not about customer redressal, but it also needs to be higher deterrence. I think that is really, really missing right now, because the way systems have worked out, we are still treating the digital frauds in the way we treat a random person thief who is just stealing from a house. But just like technology scales of fintech, it also scales stealing now. And the problem and the scale would be significantly higher. So the deterrence should also be significantly higher. I think we should really work on that.
And also, if I can just add, I think, to be fair, I think some amount of work is happening. We know for sure that I4C is very closely linked. There's something called 1930 number, which we all use and people can complain, and there is a mechanism to reverse the money, and they are looking at improving it. But I guess the way the legal system is in terms of law enforcement, fraud becomes a state subject, and then navigating within a state subject becomes much more complex than what we anticipate. I think somewhere, that is also hindering the way this is dealt with.
Can I ask a question of the audience? How many of you know of somebody personally, not a friend of a friend of a friend, but by name, a person who's had some kind of a fraud in the last 1 year? Okay, we have quite a few hands that have come up. So, and I'm sure these are not, in our first round of conversation, we sort of focused on the fact that there are many customers who are new to digital tech. Most of those folks, I'm assuming, let me ask the question, okay, how many of those were new to digital tech?
Sorry,
not one hand.
How many of those were due to?
See, I asked the question, how many people knew somebody who had been a victim of fraud? And many hands went up, at least 10, I didn't count. And I'm now asking, how many of those 10 were new to digital technology?
New to digital technology. Okay. I missed
and I haven't seen a single hand go up. I'll come to the question. I want to use this as a framing for a question here, right? So in that sense, I think, when we did that first round of conversation, we are kind of focused on a very different user base. And we are seeing a very different set of folks who are defrauded. There are probably people in that first set also who are the victim of fraud, who are not able to report because they're not here, right? But I just want to point out that this is a problem which goes across all of those groups. So which brings me to, I think, Sugandh, as a sort of a SRO who's sort of dealing with fintechs in this space. How do you think about these kinds of issues? And, you started on that path. Would love to expand.
So, I guess that's a bigger issue, right? So we always feel that, there is a regulated ecosystem which RBI looks at it or other regulator look at, and they have very clear protocols what they have to follow. And by and large, you will see their compliance there. It may not be as perfect as we want it to be, but on a customer protection side, there has been much progress overall. What we see is a ecosystem which is outside of the regulated ecosystem, which we call actually the fraudster or prankster. And we have seen very large case in loan app case, right, where 2 years back there were thousands of such loan apps in the market, and they were creating a lot of rickers, because of which we are still haunted, right, as a digital lending is still creates that kind of impression that, these are the people who are doing this kind of recovery, photo sharing and so on. But large part of that problem actually came because these were the fraud companies in the garb of being digital lender they were doing. So I think as an ecosystem level, we cannot lose sight of that fact, right? We have to be very agile to see that what is happening in the market. So the way we see it, very strong presence with our members network to know what is happening on the ground, what their customer experience is. So it could be our members telling us that their consumers face this. We do a bit of a social media monitoring to see what kind of customer complaints come in. We collaborate extensively with Google Play Store, which is sort of hub for all the apps which are coming. So because of that collaboration, we saw that problem getting solved, but new forms are emerging. So I think it's very important as an SRO, as industry, for us to be very, very close to the market, what is happening both from the supplier side, which is our members, but consumer side, right? So we keep doing a lot of surveys, for example, just to understand that what is their experience, right? So there's no good way to do it, but you have to do a lot of different kinds of things. There would be noises. Obviously, customer will say something, social media is full of noise, but you have to really distill out that what is the key theme which is emerging and therefore act on it. And of course, customer education is important because there's no way one can think that this system would be always without any fraud at all. This is not the end game which we can think of. And therefore, we think, things like AI is going to be very, very powerful in terms of a customer's ability to engage with ecosystem. A lot of apps are still in English, so we see companies like them, coming in a very big way to really interface with the customer and be able to solve for them. That is how I will say it.
So Saurabh, I think it's coming back to you as a technology provider. What is it that AI can do to support this? Because as technology moves faster, you want your solutions to also move faster to these kinds of problems. So how does AI play a role? And I think we alluded to chatbots and local languages. I would love to have you give some examples of where you're actually seeing this happen.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at, so to answer this question, let me break it down into 2 points, right? Like what are the points of intervention, and second, what is the trend that we are seeing in technology, and where do these two things intersect in some sense, right? So when I look at fraud, payment fraud or any other kind of fraud, right? Like there is education, there is prevention, then there is reporting because the fraud has already happened, and then there's the whole redressal and enforcement system in some sense, right? So if you look at it, in last 2 to 3 years, the most disruptive technology that we have is a large language model. A model which can have certain level of autonomy, is very good in framing sentences which can be comprehended by an end user, which can also be imparted certain instructions to follow, etc., etc. So it definitely does reduce the cost for a lot of interaction in some sense, right? And now you can apply it in. So if you were to say do education, now you can have a chat bot which probably takes all of your RBI and SEBI guidelines with respect to what the customers should know. It can go a level further. It can start building good financial habits for you so that you keep track of certain things. It does all of these things in your own language, so you don't ever need to have a translation. And especially for women, you don't need to rely on the male counterparts in the household, right? So these are the kind of things that you can have with this, right? Now the other thing is that these large language models are not just big. Now there is a whole family of like small language models, and the power of these small language models are that you don't need internet to run it, right? They can sit within your smartphone, or they can be deployed in a manner that can be directly accessed via a phone number, right? So if you have a helpline number 1309, or I don't know exactly, right? Like, but now what you can have is you can have an AI assistance provided without expanding the human support staff that a regulator or a company would need, and still give everyone a very high quality concierge service, right, within the financial space. So that is something that is very, very achievable, right? And you can do it at a very, very low cost because these models consume less amount of power, etc., etc.
So I want you to give examples that are already there. I don't want to hear you can. I want to hear we are doing this.
I don't actually know if we are doing this, and okay. I think it is also because bunch of these technologies are very, very new, and there's a maturity curve that they will all go through. So let me give you an example, right? Now you can actually deploy a 1 billion parameter model into a smartphone, right? If you have an Apple device, the system will actually pick your own call. So if you don't take it, the voicemail actually picks your call. So now what you can do is, and this is not something that's out there yet, right? But you can have a model sort of have a conversation with someone who is calling you, right? And can pre-vet whether the conversation line follows a pattern of a scam, where someone is trying to ask you for for your Aadhaar card number with PIN, etc., right? But these are patterns which I haven't seen really come out in that sense, right? I think bunch of these AI systems are fairly new. These are high variance systems and they will go through a maturity curve. There are a lot of cloud level stuff that we are seeing, but on devices is something that we are seeing very less. UIDAI is one example that I can give you. So Sarvam recently partnered with UIDAI, and I think one thing that we did was to basically deploy a voice chat system where someone who has requested for our Aadhaar service, if has any issues, can dial up a number and register a complaint. So what you are now doing is you are at least giving people a much easier way of accessing and reporting their grievances, right? But the full cycle of this, I think, Sanjay, it will take some time for the technology to mature, get deployed, have enough distribution for it to sort of come to fruition.
Cool. Great. So I'm a little conscious of time. I want to give time for audience questions and one comment there. I'm going to just switch to the last questions, common to all. So one of the disconnects I think I had in the middle of the panel was, saying that you're talking about a certain type of user, and yet we are seeing problems with, very different user persona. And if you're seeing it with that persona, chances it's actually even higher with, the initial very vulnerable population that we talked about. So given that, how do we build systems, whether it is as a fintech or as a regulator, that will allow us to measure this? How do we know what's the magnitude of the problem? What are the kind of metrics that we should talk? I mean, UPI publishes transaction volumes that everybody discusses, but they also publish failure rates. They also publish their estimate of payment fraud, right? I mean, all of that data is available out there, but that's not discussed as much, but we discussed that one headline number quite a bit. So what is it that we should sort of start to mature the industry towards, so that we have an idea of what's happening on the ground? And I'm asking this question for all, and we'll just go around. Maybe we'll start with Sugandh and come back this way.
So I think, from our side, we have already put out very detailed framework for the customer grievances, right? So it starts with saying that you should have a policy framework at a system and process level, but also very exact data that how many complaints receive, nature of the complaint, stat, and everything. So this is not too complicated. Everybody collects this report to RBI, and I think it's important to keep a track of this, how this is progressing. Necessarily all or high number doesn't mean that it's a bad thing, right? It's bad. Sometimes could be better because more customers are actually aware and using those, port of calls. So that way, I think it's a very good way to measure. We collect this data on an annual basis from our members. We see where the benchmark is, try to get a benchmark based on this, and which can give you high-level sense on the grievances. But I think that itself is a negative way to look at it. I think we should also capture the positive outcome. So I would say, for example, we do survey, like we just do a consumer survey where you'll ask them whether you're happy with the app which you are using from a fintech, and the answer has been very positive overall. 80% would generally say they are very satisfied because of the convenience and seamlessness and so on. So I think combining with the institutional level data along with the consumer survey is very important for to measure how things are happening, and therefore use it as a loop to go back and say, okay, this is the problem area which we should perhaps address to. So these are some of the measures which can be designed, and I think companies at their level also do a lot of these success metrics.
I want to ask companies,
yeah.
but no, let's go around. Sharan.
So your question is, what is a metric for?
What are the metrics that we should be looking at as an ecosystem, as a user, to decide whether a particular company app is trustworthy or whether a particular space, I mean, if you want to think of like digital lending or digital payments?
Yeah, I'll talk about the space. Statistics are a very funny thing. I can give you the same number and make it look like as if it's a positive as well as a negative. Let's look at the problem right now. There have been certain issues which there are pending cases. The question should be, as far as today, if you keep a cutoff date, how do we resolve those issues? Going forward, you have your systems in place because you've learned from whatever has happened, there will always be a situation where somebody will try to outsmart you in terms of using technology and systems. That is always going to be the case. You will have problems in future. Does that deter you from improving your systems? No. You will want to, of course, cover all tracks. So let's split this problem into two. If it's a metric that needs to be looked at as of today, whatever has happened earlier, how do you resolve it? RBI's annual report gives certain numbers. They say that most of 89% of the cases are old. Question is, why did the 11% come up? Now going forward, I know everybody here is, of course, consumer is at the forefront. Ultimately, that's the person who is using your platform. You will have measures in place as far as consumer education is concerned to ensure that they don't get played in terms of what is likely to happen. I think what was mentioned right now insofar as chatbot services is actually a very good, innovative way to look at things. Now the question is, if I need to solve the problem that already exists, what do I do? The only metric I can see there is the number of cases reduced. That is your metric as far as success rate is concerned. I don't think there can be anything else. Going forward, you can look at how many... Okay, so I was saying that a statistic can be used either way, right? There have been 13,000 crore transactions in a year. Out of that, there are 5 lakh cases. You can do the percentages there. It will be less than 1%. So do you think that's a success? The focus should be why there are 5 lakh cases and how to resolve them. Otherwise, numbers can be played either way. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of quantitative metrics, I think it is a justice issue, and that's why you should look at the pendency of these cases. Percentage is one metric, but I think what we are trying to ascertain is the health of the ecosystem to be able to address this. So you should definitely measure the pendency, but I think you should also, now because you have this technology, you should look at the qualitative matrix, which you couldn't scale before, right? So you should be taking into account, like, you know, user satisfaction, customer satisfaction, how was their experience of having the issue resolved, right? If the person had the issue resolved but had an absolutely terrible time getting it resolved, right? It's by no means success in some sense. So in terms of quantitative metrics, you should look at the pendency of the issues. And in terms of qualitative metrics, you should take into account what the aggrieved went through and what was the satisfaction level.
So finally, the fintech at the heart of this.
I think for us, it is, I mean, obviously, customer ratings and feedback is obviously priority. But if you talk about customer protection, it is generally the dispute resolution. If we have, let's say, 50 customers who are aggrieved because of some serious fraud or any kind of problems, we need to make sure that that 50 is resolved. So I think that has to be there.
Sure. With that, I want to thank the panel and the audience for a very engaging discussion. And so, thank you.